The streets of Cuba are full of classic cars. What you saw in Fast and Furious is exactly what you get in Cuba. Very colourful American cars from the 50s. And car culture there is on a whole different level. You would not believe what they've been doing to keep those old gems running. Most of these cars are at least 60 years old, and the few that are from this century are only owned by very rich people. But why? Why is everyone in Cuba driving old cars? How are these cars still running? And how much would a modern car cost down there? Well, first let's talk about how did so many American cars get there in the first place. Back in 1919, Cuba was the biggest Latin American importer of US cars. And it wasn't just because they liked those big old V8s, it was because they didn't really have a choice. Cuba never had a car manufacturing industry. And with Uncle Sam just 90 miles away producing thousands of vehicles, importing was the obvious solution. Many American car brands discovered a way to benefit from the high Cuban demand for cars. They basically turned the island into a testing ground for a bunch of their new vehicles. This meant that the people in Cuba could drive American cars even before these were available in the States. By 1956, there were more than 140,000 cars in the streets of Cuba. So why did these cars stop coming? The answer to that is in 1959, when Fidel Castro's Communist Party won a 6-year civil war, the Cuban Revolution. At this point, Uncle Sam was worried that Cuban communism would expand into American territory, so they set up the US embargo. This meant that any trade or commercial activity between these two countries was officially banned. From this moment forward, Cubans had to do everything they could to keep their cars running, because not only were they not getting new cars, they were also not getting new parts. Over the years, out of true necessity, some people had to travel to the US in person and then serve as mules to sneak some cars back to Cuba, which is fucking crazy. But obviously they couldn't only depend on this, so they had to figure out how to keep their cars running forever with no new spare parts. However, a few years later, other cars started entering the island, but these came from a very different place, the Soviet Union. This led to thousands of Ladas and Polski Fiats entering the islands, which was better than nothing, I guess. But even these cars would stop coming soon enough when the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. So, once more, they see themselves with no new cars or parts being imported from anywhere. However, at this point, the people of Cuba were starting to develop some serious mechanical skills. They started building new parts from scratch. When they ran out of braking fluid, they made one themselves with alcohol, brown sugar, and shampoo. To get better gas mileage in those old American V8s, they often swapped the engines for smaller diesel ones that they got out of tractors or boats. Can you imagine a beautiful 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air running diesel?
You're just ruining it. Look at my lips, you're ruining it.
That's just wrong. But I guess you can't really blame them, because with their poor living conditions, they had to do whatever it takes just to keep going. Now, it is true that since 2014, the people of Cuba are allowed to buy imported cars from other countries. However, buying a new car in Cuba is much more difficult than you might think. In fact, it's so difficult that most people would rather continue their way of life by fixing and modifying their cars. And with time though, these car modifications kind of became like a cultural thing. Many cars are now running in the streets of Cuba with parts from very different vehicles. They call them Frankensteins, and some of them look exactly what you would imagine with that name. Look at this Suzuki, for example. On this side it all looks normal, but if you see the front of the car, you'll find the grille of a Jeep Willys and the bull bar of a Kia Sportage. I think it's safe to say that car people in Cuba are the most creative and skilled, and they're also very passionate. All those Ladas that were imported at the time of the Soviet Union are now the greatest inheritance of many Cuban families. While in the rest of the world, people just make fun of Ladas. In Cuba, literally generations of hard work are put into these Soviet cars. Many of these car enthusiasts that took such great care of their cars are now benefiting from it. If you go to Cuba, you'll spot many classic American cars cruising around, serving as taxis and looking just as spiffy as the day they rolled off the lot. Taxi drivers in Cuba actually make a really good living. They can make around $30 in just 1 hour of driving. To put it into perspective, the average doctor makes around $250 in a whole month over there. But even for those taxi drivers, buying a new car is practically impossible. It's way too expensive. The government still controls the new car market and charges stupidly high taxes. For example, a 2013 Peugeot 508 costs less than $20,000. In Cuba, that same car might sell for $260,000. With an average salary of less than $200, it's practically impossible for Cubans to afford modern cars. The only realistic way to own a car in Cuba is to make sure the classics never die. Thankfully, if there's anyone who can pull that off, it's the creative people of Cuba.